See if this works. Thank you so much. I haven't been here in 3 years, and it's such a joy to finally be able to be back and seeing a lot of new faces as the movement is growing and changing and diversifying, so it's very exciting. Today I'm not going to be talking specifically about carnism. I'm going to be talking about something that is, I guess one could say, related, sustainable activism. And by sustainable activism, I simply mean what is necessary for us to be able to sustain or maintain our activism for as long as we decide that we want to. And I'll define this a bit more specifically in just a minute. So I want to just start out with a question for you. Have you ever known anyone who you believe has suffered, including yourself, who you believe has suffered from burnout due to their activism? Just raise your hand if... Okay, let me see the lights. Okay, that's a lot of people. So I'm just curious, when you say somebody suffered from burnout, you could just yell this out, like, what were the symptoms, or what did you notice that made you think this person or myself is kind of burning out or burned out? You can just yell it out. What? Low energy, very common. What else? What was it? No patience. Okay. What else? Anger towards other activists, anger towards non-vegans. I mean, there's a whole list of signs and symptoms, but you guys know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about burnout. And a lot of hands went up in this room. I've been in the movement for a long time now, for over 20 years. And in my experience as an activist myself, and also as a psychologist, burnout and unsustainable activism is probably, if not the greatest impediment or obstacle to the success of the movement, one of them. It's a very, very serious issue that I believe is not talked about nearly enough. Now, I also want to point out that it's hard enough living in this culture, carnistic culture, right? This dominant animal-eating culture where we have to walk out into the world, see corpses everywhere that other people call cuisine, see people that we love and feel connected to putting these corpses into their mouths as though nothing at all were wrong, and then be called crazy because we think that this is problematic behavior. So can you relate? Just a little bit, right? So just take a moment, just look at the person next to you for a moment. Know that this is a person who has, just one of the people, you don't have to turn your heads too much. This is a person who has chosen to live their values in a world that pressures them every single day to give up. This is a person who has chosen to do what they believe in, even though it's difficult, even though they might be ostracized, even though their relationships might suffer, even though they carry with them every single day the awareness of the enormity of animal suffering in the world. And yet every day this person wakes up and chooses to continue to practice these values, to live their truth, despite overwhelming pressure to conform. We have this in common. It's hard enough to live in this dominant, speciesist, meat-eating world. We need to recognize that even if we don't agree with each other's ideas all the time, we have something very, very important in common. We are living a truth in a society that pressures us to conform to a very violent norm. And that's difficult to do. And we need to know that we have each other, that we have these connections, and that we can appreciate each other even if we don't agree with each other all the time. So I want you to keep that in mind as we move on and talk about burnout and what I would call unsustainable activism. Okay. So I want to talk about what I mean when I talk about sustainable activism. I define sustainability as when our intake, in what we take into ourselves, what we take into our lives, is greater than or equal to our output, what we put out, okay? What we take in is greater than or equal to what we put out. Physically, okay, so with our energy, physically, emotionally, as well as socially. Sustainable activism is when our resiliency, now resiliency is the ability to manage and bounce back from stress. when our resiliency is greater than or equal to our stress response. Sustainable activism is incredibly important. First of all, it improves activist and movement effectiveness. The most effective people are often the most sustainable people. When we have sustainable lives, we don't feel so angry, we don't feel so deprived, we're at much lower risk of burning out. We model for other people the kind of movement that we want them to be attracted to. If people on the outside look at us and we look like we're frustrated, angry, depressed, exhausted, deprived, they're not going to want to become a part of this movement. So it helps us also to be more effective because when we have more energy, when we're more self-connected, not only do we model these values to the outside world and become better ambassadors for the animals and for the movement, but we actually have more energy and we're able to think more clearly and make better choices and act more effectively. It's also important because it reflects the core values of the movement. We often forget that we are animals too. So we practice a lot of compassion to the animals, and often I have seen activists practice, well, not a lot of compassion to themselves. And finally, we deserve to live happy and fulfilled lives. And sustainable activism is one of the most important components of effective activism, and it's also one of the most neglected. We tend to have a very negative association with happiness often in the movement, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So I want to talk about 4.5 steps to developing sustainable activism. And the half is because it doesn't apply to everybody. The first step is that we really need to prioritize sustainability, and I chose this quote, "It is in your moments of decision that your destiny is shaped." To prioritize sustainability. Changing your beliefs will change your behavior. Very often, I have talked to so many activists, and I have been guilty of this myself years ago in the past. We say, I know I should take better care of myself. I know I should sleep better. I know I should learn how to say no instead of saying yes to everything. I get it, but we just don't do it. It's not a priority. We say we know we should, but we're not actually committed to the change. If everybody in this room really got that sustainability was fundamental to the success of the animal rights movement, I believe that we would practice this, we would commit to practicing this, and we would have a much more effective and empowered movement, and we'd have more fun in the process. We need to get informed. Okay, so to learn about secondary traumatic stress, which I'm going to talk about today, it's a particular type of trauma that impacts many, many people in the animal rights movement, and about our own triggers, what causes us to feel this particular type of stress and the symptoms of it. Knowledge is power. We can also learn the tools to increase our resiliency and reduce stress. There has been research on this. There is a growing body of literature in trauma studies. And psychologists who work in trauma understand very practical ways, tested empirical ways to increase resiliency. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The information is out there. I recommend this website. There's actually a book on the website written by the woman who runs the website. If you can see this, traumastewardship.com. This is a psychotherapist who has dedicated her life to understanding activist trauma and to developing tools to help activists minimize their experience of trauma and increase their resiliency. So she wrote a fantastic book called Trauma Stewardship. Unfortunately, I think it's only in English, but I highly recommend you check this out. It's very, very important that we become aware of our needs. Sustainability is all about needs, and need is not a 4-letter word. Or it is a 4-letter word, but not that kind of a 4-letter word. Okay, so our needs exist on various levels, right? We have physical needs or practical needs. the need for food, financial needs, the need for time, energy, physical, practical resources. One way we can think about how important attending to our needs is if we think about, if you're in a relationship with another person, not yourself necessarily, but another person, and that person neglects your physical needs. So you have a romantic partner who never touches you, who never hugs you, who never wants to be physically intimate with you, who doesn't work with you well financially. Think about how you feel in that situation. We've probably all been in relationships where we haven't gotten our needs met. That's the primary reason that relationships typically end, is because people aren't getting their needs met. Our primary relationship is with ourself. If we don't meet our own needs, we will feel similarly. The feeling is often one of deprivation. I don't know, does that word translate well? Probably not. We feel deprived, like we are missing something that we need. We need to become aware of our needs psychologically. Again, think about it if you have a partner who's not meeting your psychological needs, somebody who you can't share ideas with, for example, somebody who doesn't stimulate you intellectually, or you can't really talk to. Everybody has psychological needs, and this is normal. We need to become aware of our emotional needs. What do we need emotionally to feel like we're taking in as much as we're putting out, or more? Our social needs and our quote-unquote spiritual needs. I put spiritual in quotes because people can define this however they want. I am defining spiritual here as anything that's beyond the physical, psychological, emotional, or social. It's, needs for meaning, for example. As activists, we put out a lot of energy physically. Time, energy, money, often. We spend a lot of time psychologically focused on the movement, on our work, thinking about animal-related issues. I don't even want to begin to talk about the emotional energy that we put out in terms of our work as animal activists, but you know what I'm talking about. We spend a lot of our social energy, our social time, time that we might be socializing with others where we're doing animal rescue work or animal rights work, for example. This work is incredibly important, and it's work we need to continue doing. But when we do it in an unbalanced way, we cross the line into the trajectory of burnout. And again, the same with our spiritual needs. So happiness should not be a four-letter word. And Grumpy Cat knows that. Step 4 is committing to taking care of our needs. So to commit to practicing sustainability. The quote that I chose here is, it is in your moments of decision that your destiny is shaped. We need to make a decision to practice sustainability. Sustainability is something that we practice, it's something we do, it's not just something we have. So we need to attend to our needs every day. Every single day. Don't wait until they've been neglected so long that it takes extra effort to fix the problem. Often we don't, and I have seen this so many times as activists, we neglect our needs, we don't recognize the emotional toll our activism is taking on us until suddenly we're crying at ridiculous television commercials or having emotional outbursts of rage at people who, piss us off a little bit. We don't take care of our needs until it's gotten so bad that we have a real problem to deal with. What I'm talking about here is to commit to engaging in prevention, to preventing ourselves from getting to the point where we actually need to do more serious work on ourselves. I mean, imagine if we just didn't go to the doctor until we were, if we were not feeling well and we never went to the doctor until we were, on our deathbeds. It would take a lot more, it would be a lot more difficult to get us well again. So ideally, get support to help you maintain your practice, okay? Friends, family, colleagues, if necessary, a therapist, if you can. Surround yourself with people who support your well-being, who support your sustainability, with people who respect you. So if you say to them, you know, I'm really sorry, I can't go out to this demo tonight as much as I want to. I'm not feeling well. I don't want to be sick tomorrow and for the rest of the week. I can't watch this video. I'm sorry. I've been too traumatized by what I've seen. I just need to take care of myself. Attending to your needs every day means paying attention every day to how you're feeling, noticing that, and asking yourself, what do I need to feel more sustained? What do I need to feel more fulfilled? And this is 4.5, because some of you are not working with an organization. If you work at an organization, help create an organizational culture that is resilient. Your organizational culture can either be resilient, resistant to stress and trauma, minimizing the likelihood that activists will be traumatized, or it can be the opposite. It can be a stressful environment that increases the chances that the people working at the organization will be traumatized and will burn out. Many organizations are somewhere in between. I'll talk a little bit more about resiliency and organizations, resilient organizations later. So I want to talk a little bit now about secondary traumatic stress, or STS, which is, for activists, it's an occupational hazard. It's almost a guarantee of being an activist. This doesn't mean that we're crazy. This doesn't mean that we develop problems that are unfixable. This means that we have a susceptibility. We have the likelihood of developing a traumatic response as activists is very high. So we need to be aware of this so that we can ideally prevent it, and if not prevent it, treat it and stop it from getting worse. And I'm going to actually have you think about some questions right now that I ask, to think about how sustainable your activism is. Now, if you have a note paper, you can write this down, or you can just try to remember, keep a count of how many of these answers you say yes to. So I'd like you to think about which of the following of these experiences you've had in the past month. So a sense that your activism is never enough, workaholism. I'm guessing there are a lot of people that can relate to this, right? Just a few. I'm only kidding. So a sense that it's never enough. You always feel like you need to be doing more. Maybe you have found yourself minimizing the suffering of others, seeing others' suffering as trivial, like not important unless it's terrible. Or maybe you have experienced some sort of diminished empathy. I've seen such horrible things, that's nothing in comparison. Difficulty listening. Now, this isn't all necessarily caused by STS, but these are classic symptoms of STS. Avoiding others, feeling easily overwhelmed by others. This can happen when we're overstimulated. Seeing the world in terms of traumatic roles. This is what I call, in my work, traumatic framing, where in our minds we start to see people as either victim, perpetrator, or hero. Can anybody relate to this? This is so common among activists in all movements. And it's a hallmark that there is something triggered, that there's something that's unprocessed that needs examining. It's a hallmark of secondary trauma often. We tend, when we think this way and we encounter somebody and they say something that we disagree with, or they do something that we think is immoral, in our minds we reduce this being, this person, to nothing more than a one-dimensional role that they are playing, in this case, perpetrator. So what happens is that we don't see people as the complicated mix of lots of dimensions that they are. We see them as good, bad, right, wrong, black, white. You're with me or you're against me. This kind of thinking is very dangerous. It's very damaging to ourselves, our own humanity, and it certainly is damaging to our relationships with others. It prevents us from connecting with others. It prevents us from recognizing that good people can do harmful things, and it doesn't make them bad people. And it prevents us from having compassion for ourselves, because activists typically try to play which role? That's right. And that's the role that we're in, is the hero, right? The hero is the one who is intervening in a traumatic, who does an intervention in a traumatic interaction and tries to stop the violence. This is the beauty of activism. This is the incredible importance of what we are doing. The danger is that when we're traumatized, when we have unprocessed emotions, our thinking is inflexible. We lose the flexibility we need to relate to people as full beings, the full beings that they are. And if we relate to somebody as perpetrator, they're going to respond probably defensively. And it's going to cause us a lot of suffering as well in the process. Okay, we have a few more here. Feeling disconnected from oneself, from the world, from others. Chronic worry or anxiety. Guilt. Many activists experience a very high degree of guilt. Maybe you feel like you diminish what's positive in your life. It's really not that good. Maybe it's hard for you to enjoy yourself. Some of you maybe can relate to this when you're out at a party and then you're starting to have fun and you think, oh my God, the animals who are suffering right in this very moment, how can I possibly be happy? Can you relate a little bit? Maybe you start to see others as guilty. When we have unprocessed guilt, and this happens to us as activists, you know, most of us grew up eating animals. Most of us grew up really as part of the problem. We weren't born and raised vegan. Then we become vegan and feel very guilty for the amount of animals that we ate in our lives. And, you know, we can have this survivor guilt. It's called survivor guilt. If we can't find compassion for ourselves and manage that guilt, then we're going to make others feel guilty. And this directly, this does not help our activism. It really gets in the way of reaching people. Self-neglect is probably, in my opinion, it's one of the most serious problems that activists experience, not attending to our own needs, seeing our own needs as unimportant. Intrusive thoughts or nightmares. Intrusive thoughts are thoughts that pop into your mind, that intrude your awareness without warning, without you wanting them to. So maybe, for example, you're just, I don't know, like reading the paper online and suddenly you just have a flash of an image of a horrible video that you've seen. Or you're just having a conversation with your friend over dinner and all of a sudden you just have this memory of, you know, a terrible campaign flyer you saw. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, so intrusive thoughts are a sign of STS, secondary traumatic stress. Nightmares, of course, similar. Increased irritability. When you're irritable, it's like low-grade anger. It's just that things make you react a bit more quickly. Cynicism, or a loss of faith in humanity or in the world. You can relate to this one, right? This is usually pretty, yeah. Another one that's quite common among animal activists. Black and white thinking. We've talked about this already when I talked about traumatic framing. You know, you're seeing the world in terms of good, bad, right, and wrong. Sometimes feeling numb. You know, sometimes we feel too much, sometimes we feel too little. Feeling numb. When you shut down, when your emotional system is on overload, you know, the body protects itself, the psyche protects itself, and it stops you from taking in more feeling, more emotion. It stops you from feeling. It's often a self-protective mechanism, but it causes problems because we lose touch with our feelings. It's hard to know what we need if we don't know what we're feeling. For example, if somebody says something that hurts your feelings and normally you would be sad, well, if you're not able to feel your sadness, you don't know that you need that person to apologize to feel better. And sometimes when we feel numb, not enough, We need a crisis. We can become attracted. You see this among activists who become attracted to crises, dangerous or difficult situations, because these urgent situations are the only thing that helps them to feel. Or sometimes becoming attracted to stimulants. Another symptom and potential problem is feeling martyred. Oh, everybody just uses me, everybody just maybe, I'm saying, imagine this isn't actually happening physically, people are not using you. Feeling taken for granted. I give and give and give and nobody gives back to me. Feeling superior to others, feeling that you can and should fix all problems. Sleep disturbances, sometimes insomnia or hypersomnia, which is oversleeping. Feeling incompetent. So you may have started out with your activism full of energy and enthusiasm and like, wow, I did this, I handed out these flyers, I reached this many people, I'm good at what I do. And then over time, feeling less and less competent, that's confident in your ability to make a difference. Depression, feeling helpless and hopeless, otherwise described as despair. Despair is feeling hopeless. There is no hope. Despair is the Achilles heel of activists and social movements. So there were 20 symptoms that I listed here, and if you've kept tab of them, this is very informal, so I'm not going to tell you anything about your score. It's just for your own knowledge. Think about how many of these you related to just in the past month. And now think about how the results of this assessment, whether you counted or not, were similar or different to what you expected. And I'm curious if anybody wants to share your own feedback. In the back, yeah? You can relate to the kind of the feeling of like it's never enough and the problem just keeps getting bigger. Yeah, and it's really hard because, we have to redefine enough. I mean, it is true. It is never enough to achieve animal liberation tomorrow. Whatever we do is not going to be enough. It has to be enough for today. And we have to really be clear about what enough is for us and what our bottom line is. And, in Western culture, in many cultures today, workaholism is celebrated. It is not looked at as the dangerous, damaging addiction that it actually is. And so many people, even non-activists, suffer from workaholism, and they don't recognize that it's problematic until it's damaged their relationships and their health. So I want to talk briefly about secondary traumatic stress and what exactly it is. So you may have heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? Yeah, okay. So STSD is secondary traumatic stress disorder, okay? It's exactly the same as PTSD. The only difference is that it impacts those who witness, okay, who see violence, rather than who are direct victims of violence. It's the only difference. PTSD affects the direct victims of violence. STSD affects the witnesses to violence. Make sense? Now, I want to differentiate STS and STSD here. So STS is secondary traumatic stress. It is, okay, now I can see you better, so. STS is a normal, natural response to witnessing violence. When you see something terrible, if you see somebody get hit by a car on the road, if you see images of slaughterhouses or vivisection practices, the reaction to be horrified, to have intrusive thoughts, to be feeling anxious and hypervigilant, probably having sleep disturbances, that is a totally normal reaction. It's actually a healthy reaction. STS is normal and healthy. It becomes a problem when it doesn't get addressed or attended to, when we don't take care of ourselves. When we have STS, it turns into STSD. D is for disorder. So the key is recognizing STS and not allowing it to turn into STSD. Now, STS is a silent killer of activists, STSD is a silent killer of activists and organizations because we are at such high risk. Because it is so normal to respond to witnessing trauma with these symptoms, if we witness it over and over and over again, we don't recognize what's happening to us, we don't take care of ourselves, and then often the organizations that we work in are encouraging us to just work harder, encouraging us to feel like it's never enough, maybe there's infighting. It can increase the chances of developing STSD. So one of the things to pay attention to is that we are more likely to develop STSD when we have a weak psycho-emotional immune system. So your immune system, right, your physical immune system is what keeps you healthy when there are germs around. Your psychological and emotional immune system is what keeps you resilient when you are exposed to trauma. So for example, I mean, you know what this feels like, those days where you haven't slept, you know, how you feel when you haven't slept for, well, for me now it's one night, but, you know, when I was in my 20s, after 3 nights of no sleep, it felt like it feels now after 1 night of no sleep. So you're exhausted, you haven't eaten well, maybe you've been traveling, you know, doing work, and you're just frustrated. When you feel so depleted, it just takes a little tiny stressor, and it really impacts you. You know what I'm talking about? You can relate to this? So this is very important to pay attention to. We as activists do not have the luxury of having a weak immune system, psychologically or emotionally. We don't have that luxury. The work that we do is constantly exposing us to trauma. It's like a doctor who works in a hospital full of sick people not taking care of their physical immune system. If we don't attend to our needs, our immune system gets lower, we're at much higher risk of developing STSD. STS is contagious. Trauma is contagious. Now, emotions in general are contagious, right? You know, when you're with somebody who's like really happy and excited, not in that like weird way, but in a really happy way, you know, you just kind of get happier around them. And when you're with somebody who's in a soul-crushing depression, no matter how happy you were originally, you're probably going to feel a little bit lower when you're around them. Emotions are contagious. The stronger the emotion, the more contagious it is. Trauma is a strong set of emotions, and it brings with it a set of behaviors. People act differently when they're traumatized. So when you have one person in an organization or a movement who's traumatized, it's easy for other people to become traumatized from being around them for a variety of reasons, some of which we'll talk about later. So the good news is that STS can be prevented, it can be reversed, and it can lead to greater effectiveness. Because the kind of practice that it takes to be sustainable, it forces us to have healthy lives so that we can actually, you know, secondary trauma forces us to do the work on ourselves that makes us healthier, that we might not have done before. Okay, so let's look at the causes of STS, besides having dinner across from your favorite cousin. So psychologists who work in trauma have found that one's personal coping style, okay, so the way that we handle stress, the way that we handle trauma, combined with the extent of exposure to trauma, determines if we get traumatized. So if we are resilient, it takes more trauma for us to become traumatized. If we are less resilient, it takes less trauma. Now, it's increased. Our chances of developing trauma, secondary traumatic stress, are increased if we have limited resources, money, for example, time. They're increased if we live in a culture that glorifies, dismisses, or denies the violence. What do you think about that one? Not good, right? And it's increased if there is a lack of social support. Psychologists have found that one of the most important factors in increasing resiliency in people is their relationships, is social support. They have looked at people in traumatic situations and found that those who developed PTSD were those who had fewer social connections, or I would say healthy social connections, and less social support. And the threat of developing STS is higher if there's the threat, of course, of legal or physical retaliation. So the symptoms we talked about are cognitive, emotional, and physical. Cognitive, meaning we think less clearly, we're less focused. Emotional, meaning we feel too much or we don't feel enough, for example. And physical, fatigue, and some of the other emotions that we talked about, feelings we talked about before. Now, let's talk briefly about STS and needs. STS causes us to neglect ourselves, but it is also the result, it's a consequence of us neglecting ourselves. The more we neglect ourselves, the more we increase the chances we will have STS. And then it becomes a vicious cycle. Activists have a paradoxical relationship with needs, if you think about it, right? We over-focus on the needs of others. We are over-focused on the needs of the animals, of the movement, sometimes of the organization, and we under-focus on our needs. And the key is to balancing these two things. So attending to our needs will help us prevent and treat STS, and that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about now. So how do we develop resiliency? What are some things that we can do to help us build our own resiliency? One thing is to witness carefully. To witness is to see with your eyes and mind as well as with your heart. Witness carefully. Don't over-witness. I cannot stress this enough. I can't tell you how many vegans have told me that they're traumatized from seeing Earthlings for the 4th time. And I'm like, why did you watch it? Or because what the animals suffer is nothing compared to me suffering for 2 minutes, watching this video clip or this movie. It doesn't help. Right? You don't need to see this. If you already know what's happening, you don't need to see it. It's really counterproductive. If you have no choice, if you're doing undercover work, obviously that's your job. But for those of you who are witnessing because you feel it's somehow a moral obligation to the animals, you're not doing anything to help the animals by watching slaughter videos. What you're doing is damaging yourself, so it's harder for you to do the work you need to do for them. Give yourself permission not to witness. There are a number of people in the animal rights movement who continue to show graphic movies to animal rights activists. Oh my God, 10 minutes, okay. And I think that this can be counterproductive. So let's go quickly. Don't make your colleagues unintentional witnesses. Get somebody's permission. Ask people before you tell them horrible stories so that they don't get traumatized by over-witnessing. Get witnessed regularly. If there's just one person in your life, who sees you, it's one of the hardest things about being a vegan in this culture. It's like you're so invisible. You're doing some of the most important work on the planet, and it's invisible. And the suffering you experience and the work you put in is invisible. If there's just one person who says, I get it, it's hard, thank you. It's so important to have at least one person in your life who you feel really sees you. So you're not the crazy vegan at the dinner table, you're just you to them. Pause daily. Every day. Build in unstructured time every day. Unstructured time where you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. An hour, whatever it is. I'm not talking about 5 minutes, right? Like at least an hour, half an hour, at least a half an hour of unstructured time so that you can recharge your batteries and decompress. I am not like a healthy, effective person if I don't do this. And I know at the end of the day, When I'm exhausted and I've been around people, people all day, I just want to sit down and be left alone, or, be with my partner and just do whatever I want to do, watch a movie, play a video game, read a book, just something that turns my brain off and allows me not to be thinking about the problems of the world. Cultivate self-awareness. You can't take care of your needs if you're not self-aware. Become aware of your thoughts, your feelings, your needs, your triggers, the things that make you upset, the things that bother you. This requires commitment. This means you have to pay attention. Pay attention to what's happening inside of yourself. It's not something most of us do naturally, but it's something all of us can learn to do and need to learn to do. Just stop. Every hour, just stop. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? The more you know yourself, the better you are to take care of yourself. It's like having a partner, right? And wanting to take care of your partner's needs. If you don't know what makes them laugh, your humor might not work. If you don't know what kind of food they like, cooking for them might not give them what they need. You need to get to know yourself. And thoughts and feelings will yell if they're not listened to when they talk and whisper. Communicate with yourself compassionately. Pay attention to your inner dialogue. Psychologists call the inner dialogue the conversation we are always having with ourselves. We are always talking to ourselves. Most of us are completely unaware of this. What's amazing is when you stop and listen to your inner dialogue, you get a very good sense of what your relationship is like with yourself. Again, if you think of a couple, you can get a sense of what their relationship is like when you overhear the way that they talk to each other. If they talk to each other with love and compassion, it tells you something very different than if they're constantly telling each other what they could have done, should have done better, what they've done wrong, and criticizing each other. Most people have a very critical inner dialogue, internal dialogue. Most people would never tolerate being talked to by another person the way that they talk to themselves. Stop. You could do this every 2 hours or something. You can set your watch. Nobody wears watches anymore. Set your phone to beep every couple of hours and just listen to how you're talking to yourself. Change it. You can change it they have done extensive studies. When you become aware of your inner dialogue and you change it, you shift your perceptions in a significant way. Don't be a perfectionist. Perfectionism is a major obstacle to sustainability. If you're, spending time agonizing over whether to eat this, take a bite of a cookie that your favorite grandmother has made you that has, cheese with casein in it or something, tiny little trace of something, and you're just agonizing and you feel so guilty saying no to her, but then you feel so guilty eating the cookie. Don't be a perfectionist. You benefit the animals more by taking care of yourself than by being ideologically right all the time. Okay, this point I can never, ever stress enough. In my other job, when I have time, I'm actually a relationship coach. Develop healthy relationships. There have been many studies on the impact of relationships on our lives and on our well-being. And these studies have found over and over and over again that healthy relationships are critical for physical health, for longevity. People in healthy relationships live longer. They get sick less often. They're less likely to get depressed, and they're less likely to have a whole bunch of other problems. Healthy relationships are relationships that support us and allow us to support the other. They're people who get us. They are relationships that are enjoyable. They're not just all about work. They're relationships with people who hold us accountable. They don't just always tell us how great we are and avoid all conflict, but they point out to us areas that we need to grow in a compassionate way. Healthy relationships ultimately help us to become our better selves and ideally our best selves. If you give yourself permission to love non-vegans, you open up your relationship repertoire further. And I know this is difficult. Relationships it's a difficult issue for vegans. You know, often we become vegan and it causes a great disruption in our relationships for many, many reasons. And that's a whole other talk that maybe I'll give next year. It can be very challenging. One thing that we can do is we can give ourselves, it's hard to love someone whose behaviors we hate. But if we separate behavior from character, if we recognize that for a person to go vegan, it requires a shift of consciousness that doesn't happen unless that person is ready for it to happen. We can recognize that good people eat animals and it doesn't make them bad people, even if we don't like the behavior and we see the behavior as bad. This allows us to stay connected with maybe some of our previously important relationships in our lives, and it helps us be more compassionate. Effective communication is a cornerstone of healthy relationships. So if we learn effective communication, it's a powerful way to enhance our relationships and to make them a lot easier. I highly recommend this book. I have a workshop on effective communication that I'm going to start giving also. This book is the best book I've found on effective communication. It's called Messages, the Communication Skills Book. When we can communicate effectively, we're less frustrated, saying, oh, I wish I had said that, or my feelings were hurt, but I didn't know how to respond. It makes life much easier. There have been a lot of studies that practicing gratitude enhances well-being and positive thinking. It's hard when you're an animal rights activist, but if you can commit, and they've actually done empirical research on this, and they found that people who committed to actually being grateful, right? Practicing gratitude every day, at least once a day, where they write down what they're grateful for in a journal, or they just say it to themselves, increased their level of happiness, and therefore their level of resiliency. Give yourself permission not to advocate, right? Sometimes you might want to go to a party or be with friends and just be a friend and not the vegan, right? Like, we don't have to turn everyone around us. You're not responsible for turning the world vegan. Yes, it's important to engage in activism. It's important to engage in effective activism. But if we believe it is our responsibility to turn everyone we come into contact with vegan, we are going to be exhausted because it's really exhausting. Sometimes, and this is where self-awareness comes in. Sometimes you need to just say, like, if I am tonight, if I have to be the person talking about where I get my protein from at the dinner party, it's just going to be too much. Don't. It's a better investment in the animals if you invest in your sustainability. I highly recommend also that you learn about how carnism, the ideology of eating animals, impacts vegans. I have a whole other talk on this, but what I will recommend, if you're not familiar with my work on this, is to read my article, Speaking Truth to Power. It's all of the ways that vegans are stereotyped and treated with, often with disrespect by members of the dominant culture who don't necessarily know that they're treating us with disrespect, but who are doing it nonetheless because it's built into the mentality of the culture. If you can identify these behaviors, you're much less likely to take them personally, more likely to recognize that they are the result of this social dynamic. And almost finally, mindfulness, practice mindfulness. Studies have shown, many studies have shown that mindfulness is a very powerful way to enhance cognitive dysfunction here. Sustainability, that word. To develop resiliency and enhance sustainability. Mindfulness is a practice, it's an ancient Buddhist practice that's been adopted by practitioners, psychologists in the Western world because of its efficacy. It's a meditative practice of bringing yourself back to the present moment so that you're not worrying about what's going to happen in the future and all the animals that are going to be dying because you didn't do enough work today and you're not traumatized about everything you've been thinking about in the past. I recommend headspace.com. Headspace is an app that you can download and that will actually help you to become more mindful. It helps people to meditate and it's a guided form of meditation. So check out headspace.com. If you're in an organization, help cultivate a healthy, resilient organization. So speciesist culture that we live in causes us to feel unappreciated, like our efforts are never enough, we're demoralized, and we also learn to be ashamed of our feelings. Have you ever been told that you're just too sensitive? Yeah, like all the time, right? I mean, it's one of the ways the dominant culture maintains itself. If we're too sensitive, we're not rational enough, right? And of course, what the world needs when it comes to emotions around animal issues is more emotion, not less. Our sensitivity is our gift, and it's a sign of health, not pathology. When we work in an organization that pathologizes emotions and that encourages the very things I've talked about that are the opposite of resiliency, we increase the chances of secondary traumatic stress. So resilient organizations can counter speciesist culture by expressing appreciation, building in practices and policies that express appreciation, celebrate successes so people do feel like it's enough, discouraging overworking. In my organization, if we find out that people are like working through their breaks and through the weekends and they have a pattern of doing this, we talk to them and we actively tell them we want them to stop. So I'm going to close with a quote that I think sums up nicely what I've been trying to say today. Don't ask yourself only what the world needs. We're already doing that. Don't ask yourself only what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and go do that, because the world really needs people who have come alive. So thank you for the hard work that you've been doing, and I hope that today's presentation has been helpful for you as an activist, as a pioneer in this very, very important movement, to take better care of yourself, the activists around you, and to lead the fulfilling, sustainable lives that you deserve and that the movement needs. Thank you.